Right now, an urgent decision on the war. Zelensky's trump cards have worked after all. The White House approved Kyiv's victory pact, and the Kremlin is forced into something shocking. Ukraine is officially claiming victory, peace for Kyiv, and a new suffocating news for Russia. A real sensation. Fedorov has come out with an urgent statement. The front has changed. The AFU launched a phenomenal process right on the front line. The Russian army began preparing for surrender. Ukrainian ballistics will shatter all myths after all. You won't believe it. The Kremlin has actually started selling its territories. Putin fell for the money. And all of this happened right now. Greetings, I'm Renata Aslanova, and we're beginning. The Kremlin is starting to get even more nervous. The West has done the simply impossible for Kyiv. The G7 leaders officially agreed on a package of decisions that significantly strengthen Ukraine's capabilities in both defending its own airspace and hitting targets deep in the RF rear. Additional air defense systems and interceptor missiles, new capabilities for long-range strikes, and more. Now this is a new reality.
We are also ready to consider the possibility of granting Ukraine appropriate licenses to help increase the volume of military production in Ukraine.
And that's not all. In parallel, the West is preparing a new blow to Russian revenues. Oil and gas, which still remain the Kremlin's main financial backbone, are falling under the sanctions pressure. It seems that for Moscow, bad news continues to arrive from several directions at once. Trump personally decided to deal a powerful blow to the RF. The U.S. president stated that Washington is ready to reintroduce tough restrictions against the RF oil sector in case of further escalation by the Kremlin. In Europe, this gesture was seen as fateful.
And I saw that he was very inclined to cooperate, and I also saw how carefully he listens. And in this regard, again, it gives me a certain optimism that we here, as Europeans and as Americans, are now doing everything possible together to put an end to the war.
The Kremlin received another unpleasant signal from the West. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer stated that there is complete unity among the leaders. Sanctions against the RF are working, and Ukraine continues to demonstrate results on the battlefield. Moreover, the West believes that now is the time not to loosen, but on the contrary, to tighten the screws on Moscow even more. So there's more to come. This is truly hard to believe. The decisive 6 months have begun. Ukraine's defense forces are launching a deadly machine for the enemy right on the front line. The battlefield is finally preparing to come under the control of the AFU. Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhail Fedorov spoke about this in an interview with TSN.
In fact, we are forming a different battlefield, because there are different supplies, the quality of drones is increasing, and a different reality is being formed on the battlefield. In the next 6 months, we will definitely have the advantage.
According to him, when it becomes increasingly difficult to show results on the battlefield, Putin returns to his usual tactic of missile terror against Ukrainian cities. At the same time, the official emphasized, these attacks do not change the situation at the front, do not stop the production of Ukrainian weapons, and only demonstrate how nervously the Kremlin reacts to its own problems. So despite everything, Ukrainian ballistics are destined to be...
Ukrainian ballistics will change everything in this war. It will fundamentally change Ukraine's status in the world. We have already changed it many times, but this is a completely different league. I can only quote our president here that Ukrainian ballistics will exist, and they will strike at Russia.
It seems the Kremlin has received another wake-up call. What will happen next? We are following the developments. This moment has finally arrived. In the Russian Federation, it seems, they are increasingly resorting to forced concessions, which are already difficult to hide behind loud propaganda. According to Reuters, Russia is effectively moving to a hidden sell-off of its resources and assets, and this time no longer within the usual circle of allies.
The Indian mining company IREL is in talks with Rosneft for the supply of rare earth element samples from Tomtor, a Siberian deposit acquired by the Russian oil producer last year. As New Delhi seeks to secure supplies of critical minerals, a field dominated by China, a source said.
It became known that the negotiation process is taking place at the level of government structures. Samples will undergo primary processing on Russian territory before being sent to India. Note that the deposit is located in the Siberian region of Yakutia and is considered one of the world's largest undeveloped sources of rare earth metals. It seems Putin, despite gritting his teeth, is ready to share his own with allies because of a desperate situation. What piece of Russian land he will be ready to give away next time is still a mystery. However, we are keeping our finger on the pulse. The Kremlin is nervously revising the scenario for the future. What was until recently called stability today resembles a system working at the limit of its capabilities. Russia is on the brink. A coup is literally breathing down the dictator's neck. You won't believe it, our people have committed a shocking act. The Russian economy has collapsed. Problems have covered Moscow like a blanket. Putin has lost control of the situation. Has the time really come to sign the capitulation? Let's watch. Putin is already one step away from collapse. The smell of crisis is becoming clearer in the Kremlin, and this time it is not the opposition sounding the alarm. Even in the Russian State Duma, it is becoming increasingly difficult to hide nervousness. KPRF Deputy Vyacheslav Markayev openly accused the Kremlin of corruption and warned that Russia is approaching a powerful social explosion. According to him, the time of illusions is over, and the responsibility for possible chaos will lie entirely with the current government. For a system where officials have competed for years in loyalty to Putin, such statements sound like a very alarming signal from within. Even more interesting is that Markayev spoke directly about the risk of mass unrest and effectively admitted the situation in the country is becoming increasingly unstable. Another communist deputy, Rinat Suleimanov, who previously called for ending the war as soon as possible, has joined the criticism. It seems that even in political circles loyal to the Kremlin, an uncomfortable question is being asked more and more often. How much longer can Russia endure this war? Reasons for dissatisfaction are piling up one after another. Massive internet outages, the lack of tangible success at the front, economic problems, and regular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian rear are increasingly affecting the public mood. And while propaganda continues to talk about stability, even representatives of the system itself are starting to speak openly about the dangerous social tension building up behind the facade of Kremlin confidence. Meanwhile, Kyiv is adding fuel to the fire. Volodymyr Zelensky's publication of intelligence on the internal situation in Russia was a real cold shower for Putin. The president stated that Ukrainian intelligence had obtained documents about the real internal political situation in Russia. The very reports that land directly on Putin's desk. And even despite the tradition of Russian officials sugarcoating reality, the picture emerging there is quite bleak.
We understand that Putin is rarely given completely truthful information without embellishment, but even what he sees in the documents that reach him still allows for certain conclusions to be drawn.
According to intelligence, the level of Russian dissatisfaction with Putin continues to grow and shows no signs of stabilizing even on the eve of the September elections. Moreover, support for the ruling party is gradually declining, and this creates a rather uncomfortable dilemma for the Kremlin: either explain to voters why everything is getting worse, or once again demonstrate miracles of electoral mathematics. No less alarming for Moscow is the growth of protest sentiment in the regions. While Russian propaganda talks about national unity, the authorities themselves seem to be carefully calculating where and when accumulated dissatisfaction might break through. Especially considering that summer is still ahead, with its economic problems, strikes on logistics, fuel difficulties, and Ukrainian drone attacks.
We believe that these reports do not yet account for potential events in June, July, and August, which cannot fail to further impact the situation in Russia.
And this is where it gets most interesting. Ukraine no longer hides its intention to continue increasing pressure on Russia, military, economic, diplomatic. This means that the most difficult months for the Kremlin may still be ahead. After all, when the economy weakens, social problems accumulate, ratings drop, and drones arrive all at once, even the most powerful propaganda starts to fail.
Perfectly justified pressure on Russia for this war will continue and intensify. And not just our pressure. Consequently, by September, Putin will face even worse indicators.
This is a kind of public reminder. While Russian propaganda tries to convince the world of the regime's stability, Ukraine increasingly demonstrates a completely different image of the Kremlin, one that is losing control over events and is forced to constantly put out new crises. The past few months for Moscow have turned into a real streak of bad luck. Fuel problems in a country that for decades took pride in its status as an energy superpower, strikes on logistics, attacks on strategic sites, and constant failures in the information war. A rather sarcastic picture is emerging. The Kremlin continues to talk about its strength, but spends more and more time not on the offensive, but on dealing with the consequences of its own problems. Ukraine's main bet now is not just on destroying individual targets, but on maintaining a pace of strikes and challenges that Russia simply cannot adapt to in time. The longer the economic, budgetary, and social exhaustion continues, the weaker the Kremlin's ability to respond to new strikes becomes. And when the system starts to lag behind events, every new problem automatically generates several more. That is why, on the eve of the G7 summit, the NATO meeting, and a new package of sanctions, Kyiv is actively promoting a simple message for Western partners. Russia no longer looks like a party that is in control of the situation. On the contrary, more and more signs indicate that the Kremlin's resources are being depleted faster than it can hide it. And as we know, people are much more willing to invest in someone who can win than in someone who tries to explain away their problems with more propaganda tales. And the most unpleasant thing for Moscow is that problems are piling up from several sides at once. A new package of EU sanctions, increased pressure on the shadow oil fleet, risks to energy revenues, and an increasingly active Ukrainian campaign of long-range strikes. If until recently the Kremlin was selling the world the image of an impregnable fortress, today this image increasingly resembles the facade of a building where cracks are visible even from afar. And it seems Ukraine's main task now is not to let these cracks heal, but to turn them into a real collapse. A real sensation. Our people finally managed to get revenge on Putin. Crimea is losing its connection with Russia. Russians are cursing the peninsula. It's a real trap there. Emergency evacuation is just around the corner. People are almost fighting at gas stations and store shelves are empty. The Crimean crossing is turning into a dead zone. Now the mechanism for the deoccupation of Crimea has been officially launched. What is happening right now? Don't miss the shocking details ahead. Magyar's birds are liberating Crimea. The commander of the AFU Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brovdy, stated that Ukraine intends to isolate the occupied peninsula from Russia and gradually take full control of key supply routes. According to him, a series of strikes on the so-called Novorossiya Highway, which connects the Rostov region with Crimea through the occupied territories of Ukraine, has already yielded tangible results. In the last month alone, traffic intensity there has decreased by more than 2/3. What Kremlin propaganda just yesterday called a reliable land corridor increasingly resembles a high-risk route where every trip could be the last for equipment or cargo. Magyar compared the strike of Ukrainian drones on transport in open sections of the road to hunting partridges in an open field. And in this satirical metaphor, there's little that's funny for Russian logistics. Convoys that for years moved unhindered into Crimea are now increasingly forced to look not at road signs, but at the sky. The main goal, according to the commander, is not just the destruction of equipment. Ukraine aims to establish conditions in which staying in the occupied region of Crimea, as well as using the supply routes to the peninsula, becomes far too dangerous and much too costly an endeavor. If these plans are realized, the peninsula, which the Kremlin has presented for years as a symbol of its victory, risks turning into a military enclave cut off from key resources, where each new day will bring more questions and fewer answers. Crimean logistics are bursting at the seams, and the occupiers, trying to bypass one set of ruins, keep driving into new ones. After the defense forces' strikes on the Chonhar Bridge, the Russian command hastily rerouted equipment flows through Armyansk, but it seems the Ukrainian military was already waiting for this maneuver. According to the commander of the 1st Separate Assault Regiment named after Dmytro Kotsyubailo, Dmytro Filatov, the Chonhar Bridge sustained critical damage and now requires large-scale restoration. Traffic on it has effectively stopped. Neither trucks nor passenger cars use it anymore. The occupiers are trying to save the situation with pontoon crossings and new routes, but every such plan B turns into yet another problem. The Russians received the most painful blows specifically near Armyansk. After blocking Chonhar, the enemy concentrated a large convoy of trucks with fuel and ammunition there. As Filatov reported, the Ukrainian military struck this target, resulting in a convoy of about 50 vehicles being hit. Some of the trucks were destroyed along with their critically important cargo.
We carried out another operation. We'll share more details about its results later. Due to the damage to the Chonhar Bridge, the enemy concentrated a large number of trucks with military cargo that were moving specifically through Armyansk. Accordingly, during the strike, we managed to hit trucks carrying fuel and ammunition. There were about 50 vehicles there, and some of them were destroyed.
It's particularly telling that the decision to strike the Chonhar Bridge was made after receiving information about fuel being transported across it for Russian troops. Only 6 hours passed from the decision to the execution of the operation, and the Ukrainian military had calculated the route through Armyansk in advance, knowing that after the strike on Chonhar, the occupiers would seek bypass routes. As a result, Russian commanders are now forced to think not about offensive plans, but about how to even deliver fuel and ammunition to the front line. According to Filatov, such strikes provide not only an immediate effect, but also create long-term problems, forcing Russia to spend enormous resources on restoring bridges, crossings, and logistical routes. The commander himself emphasized that this success was made possible by systemic pressure on the entire occupation logistics. Strikes on Mariupol and the Berdyansk highway forced the Russians to reroute supplies through Crimea, and when the cargo flows changed direction, Ukrainian forces quickly cut off that route as well.
We realized this, blocked those routes for them quite quickly, and continued to further weaken the enemy. And if this trend continues, the main problem for the occupiers in the near future may not be a Ukrainian offensive, but a simple question: how to deliver at least fuel and shells to their troops.
It seems the operation to liberate Crimea began long ago, and it's happening not through loud statements, but through the systematic destruction of everything keeping the occupation afloat. Bridges are being destroyed, fuel and ammunition convoys are burning, and logistical arteries, one after another, are falling under the control of Ukrainian drones. For years, the Kremlin convinced the world that Crimea was forever tied to Russia. But today, that connection is breaking right before our eyes. And the more the occupiers seek bypass routes, the more obvious a simple truth becomes. An isolated Crimea is no longer a future scenario, but a process that is happening right now. And when the enemy loses roads, supplies, and the ability to move safely, the issue of deoccupation stops being a dream and gradually becomes a matter of time. Putin has finally played his last card. Chinese loyalty has suddenly turned into unceremonious disregard for Moscow. Beijing is gradually increasing its influence, securing favorable terms, and effectively dictating its own rules where Russia recently tried to appear as an equal partner. It seems the geopolitical chessboard is changing before our eyes. Xi Jinping is taking entire regions away from Putin. The friendship has ended after all. Be the first to know, China is devouring Russia. Quietly, without extra words, Xi Jinping is taking territories, while Putin gladly gives them up and bows at his feet. Beijing is turning the Far East and Siberia into a raw material appendage with a long Chinese contract. A prime example is the Zashulanskoye coal deposit in Transbaikalia, developed jointly by Russian and Chinese companies. The project is designed for a century of mining, and the Russian side is also generously handing out tax breaks. In effect, it looks like a long-term lease of the region in exchange for investment, with Beijing as the main beneficiary. Starting in 2027, they plan to ship about 5 million tons of coal to China annually from here. That's hundreds of trucks every single day. New routes are being laid literally through forests near mineral water sources and protected nature zones. Ecology, it seems, is a secondary detail in this scheme that simply wasn't included in the business plan. Parallel to resources, China is actively entering regions through people and business. In the Baikal region, tourist infrastructure is growing to cater to Chinese visitors. Investors are buying up land and building hotels, pushing out local entrepreneurs. By various estimates, up to 2 million Chinese citizens may already be in the Far East. Against this backdrop, it looks less like a partnership and more like a gradual economic reformatting of the region for Beijing's interests. And while Russia gradually turns into a resource periphery for China, even harsher scenarios are appearing in the Chinese media space. No longer about cooperation, but about the actual division of Russian territories in the event of a crisis. And strangely enough, this is presented not as a fantasy, but as a geopolitical calculation. An article appeared in the Chinese media where potential control over 7 million square kilometers of the Russian Far East is directly discussed in the event of an internal collapse of the Russian Federation. The authors point out that due to the war against Ukraine, Russian forces have been redeployed to the west and the eastern regions remain virtually empty, with minimal military presence and weak control over the territory. The economic conclusion sounds even harsher. Russia, according to the authors' estimates, is rapidly degrading, and its economy is allegedly smaller than a single Chinese province. And here cold logic appears. If the center of the Russian Federation weakens, the Far East with its resources should not go to waste. At the same time, the authors cautiously warn Beijing against direct military expansion, hinting at a scenario of international isolation similar to the situation around Crimea. Instead, another approach is proposed: soft absorption through investments, long-term contracts, and support for friendly forces in the region, which formally maintain independence but effectively become dependent on China. In fact, the main idea in the text is that Russia no longer seems capable of fully controlling its own eastern territories, and China, taking advantage of the moment, can gradually fill this vacuum of influence. And even if all this is presented as analytics, the very appearance of such scenarios in the public space looks like a signal. Beijing is already thinking in terms of a post-Russia era.
The collapse of Russia is no joke. Only through careful preparation can we move forward calmly.
And perhaps the Celestial Empire will not wait for the collapse of the Russian Federation, but will speak the language of force. China is building a giant military megacomplex in the desert, so massive that Western analysts are already saying directly they have never seen anything like it before. We are talking about a new strategic zone near intercontinental nuclear missile silos where, according to Reuters, more than 80 launch pads, bunkers, a railway hub, airfields and control centers are being built. Essentially a full-fledged military fortress of the future. Of particular concern are 3 giant octagonal complexes surrounded by fortifications and protected infrastructure. Experts suggest that electronic warfare systems, command centers, or elements of nuclear infrastructure, including the preparation and deployment of mobile missile systems, could be located there. But the key detail is that no one knows exactly what is inside. And it is precisely this uncertainty that scares analysts the most. In fact, we are talking about an unprecedented expansion of China's nuclear architecture against the backdrop of an intensifying confrontation with the United States, especially around Taiwan. Not just a military base is growing in the desert, but a new level of strategic reality, where Beijing demonstrates its readiness to play the long game. And while the world tries to comprehend the scale of what has been seen, experts admit they have not yet recorded such a level of military construction in the era of nuclear states. For Putin, this is a real geopolitical cold shower. Russia looks less and less like an independent center of power and more like a resource periphery in China's orbit. China isn't acting rashly just yet, but it seems Putin might see the day when Xi Jinping takes what's his, swiftly and without warning. And that concludes our broadcast. We're continuing to monitor the latest developments right now, so we can be the first to bring them to you. Don't forget to subscribe. See you.